We all love our pets. Little balls of fur, scales, and what have you, that we as humans can project ourselves onto. This small creature by our side follows us around, vies for our attention, and so on. You're a smart person. You know how pets work, so I won't go into unnecessary detail on that one. Suffice to say, pets are a delight. Most of the time. But where do we draw the line on what is and is not a pet? Sure, there are some animals that are more domesticated than others. But with the sufficient enclosure and adequate provision of needs, one can make the argument that almost anything can be a pet. The Truman Show is a movie about a show about Truman Burbank. At first glance, Mr. Burbank is living the American dream. He has a well-paying, semi-fulfilling job, a beautiful wife who is ostensibly enamored with him, and a beloved, longtime best friend. But all of these things are a lie. The aforementioned job is little more than a plot device. The loving wife is a paid actress who spends just as much time shilling products as she does participating in her relationship. His best friend is not his best friend, but more a handler to make sure that Truman never steps out of line. Truman Burbank is not an everyday average Joe, but instead, he is the star of the world's most popular television program. As the movie progresses, an oblivious Mr. Burbank becomes more and more aware that not all is as it seems in his reality. The proverbial walls are closing in, and he wants out. As these cracks in his reality begin to form around him, he pokes and prods at them, making these cracks grow wider and wider until they are no longer the small spider webs that they once were, but instead are yawning chasms. The film culminates with Truman escaping his prison and consequently ending the Truman Show. As the film closes, the creator and executive producer of the titular program has a candid exchange with the star. This creator speaks to Truman from on high, touting the virtues of his fabricated reality and besmirching the perils of the real world. But despite all these things told to him from the heavens, Truman leaves. He escapes his comfortable but ultimately hollow reality in favor of another existence. An existence where his every action won't be scripted. An existence where he will not be protected from the difficult things in life. An existence where he will be free. While it should be abundantly clear to anyone with eyeballs, and some of those without, that there are a myriad of differences between Truman Burbank and a Labradoodle. But one thing that the character and the chimeric canine have in common is that they are both pets. Truman Burbank has been a part of the Truman Show since the day he was born. His entire life, leading into the events of the film, has transpired in front of a camera for the enjoyment of audiences around the world. Similar to many animals that one would see at any given zoo, Truman was essentially bred into captivity. That isn't to say that Truman, or ostensibly Labradoodles, live an uncomfortable lifestyle. One would assume that if a person were to pay 4 figures for a dog, that dog would be living in the lap of luxury. And the same could be said for Truman Burbank. In the fiction of The Truman Show, Mr. Burbank lives a life that many around the world would kill for. He has a good job, a nice house, and so on. All of the physical requirements for a fulfilled life are at least met, if not exceeded, but still he yearns for something more. Despite the lavish trappings of his confinement, he is confined nonetheless. This is where Mr. Burbank and the Labradoodle differ. A dog would be more than happy to live its life in a proverbial, and sometimes I guess literal, cage. In fact, in the instance of the Labradoodle, it would be almost cruel to release the animal into the wild, as the creature is not fit for the wilderness, not fit for the real world. As a result, it would almost surely perish shortly after its release. But the inverse is true for Truman, and by proxy, all humans. While cats, dogs, and other animals have been domesticated and become accustomed, if not reliant, on captivity, humans seem to balk at the notion. We crave agency, even if that desire is potentially at odds with our physical well-being. That leads us into the topic of God and free will. I'm a reasonably ardent atheist, but it's hard to look at this scene and not see a representation of the divine. The film is clearly trying to say something in this regard, and I would be remiss if I didn't at least touch on it. If it is the case that Truman is a prisoner, a pet, or most aptly in this analogy, a puppet, it would then be clear that the producer, aka the creator, is a representation of God. Following this paradigm, it would be reasonable to assume that the film is making the point that any sort of creator would ostensibly view us as playthings, beings whose sole reason for existence is to entertain those watching over us. But in line with the ending of the film, we do have free will. With enough effort, we can cast off our puppet strings and remove ourselves from the snares of the divine. Following this line of thinking, we all have agency. All we must do is assert it. To some degree, this is almost inverse messaging to the Garden of Eden story. Again, I'm far from a religious person, but my understanding of this story is that God told Adam and Eve that they could do anything they want except eat that one apple. Eve ate the apple, and the two were banished from the Garden of Eden. In the case of the Truman Show, the set of the production, into a world of suffering and woe. This biblical tale seems to tout the virtues of obedience to God and the treacherous nature of free will, while the Truman Show seems to do quite the opposite. Instead of narratively admonishing the protagonist when he eats the apple, this course of action is presented as if it were a clear moral good. The creator, in the case of the film, informs the protagonist of the dangers of life outside the garden and implores him to stay. But Truman does not abide by these declarations and warnings. He voluntarily leaves the garden, and instead of being condemned to a life of suffering, is celebrated by many of those watching at home. He eats the apple, and instead of being punished, he is ostensibly rewarded. Great white sharks are one of the few animals that cannot be held in captivity. It's been tried time and time again, but time and time again, such an endeavor has failed. Regardless of the specifications of the enclosure, any great white that has been captive has died after a very short amount of time. The comparison to Truman Burbank should be obvious. He has been held captive for his whole life, and at the end of the film would rather drown than spend another day in the fabricated reality in which he finds himself. He is willing to cast aside his mother, his wife, his friends, and even his life, because while these things are the only things he has ever known, he also knows them to be nothing more than hollow parodies of the real thing. He would rather die than spend one more day, one more hour, one more minute inside his gilded cage.